Hemoglobin is an example of a protein with quaternary structure, so it contains more than one polypeptide chains, namely 4. 2 of them are alpha chains and 2 of them are beta chains. It is, of course, a globular. It has a roughly spherical shape, and it is conjugated to the prosthetic group that we said is called heme. Sorry, my pen appears to not be cooperating, so just give me just one quick second. I do want to be able to jot things down for you guys. That's peculiar. Sorry about that. I'll sort it out before. I'll move on now because we need to get through this, and I'll sort it out for next session. Oh, it appears to be working somewhat. It's a globular protein, and it's conjugated to what we call the prosthetic group, which is called heme. So this here is the structure of heme. You do not need to memorize it. You do, though, need to remember that it contains iron, and it's crucial. Iron is crucial for the function of heme. Each heme group can bind to one oxygen molecule. And since there are 4 heme groups, 1 on each polypeptide chain, each hemoglobin molecule can bind 4 oxygen molecules in total. Again, for those of you not taking chemistry, 1 molecule and atom of oxygen are not the same. Sometimes they try to catch you with that. 1 molecule of oxygen contains 2 atoms. So you've got 4 molecules, but 8 atoms in total. Just remember that because they do try to catch you sometimes. It's important that we are able to describe and explain the hemoglobin saturation curve. So hemoglobin is found inside red blood cells, and it will basically transport oxygen from the lungs to the respiring tissues to allow for aerobic respiration, of course. Respiring tissues are basically all of our tissues. There's no alive cell or tissue that doesn't respire, that doesn't need oxygen. Hemoglobin undergoes conformational changes when it binds oxygen, and these conformational changes are collectively known as cooperative binding. What does cooperative binding actually mean? And sometimes we're asked to define what cooperative binding means. It means that and again, I'd advise you to sort of copy that phrasing for consistency. Binding of the first oxygen molecule changes the orientation of the heme groups, or if you don't remember that, you can just simply say that it causes a conformational change to hemoglobin such that it makes it more accessible to more oxygen molecules. So what it means is that how do we connect that to this curve? By the way, this is not required for Edexcel A. It means that when we have low partial pressures of oxygen, the word partial pressure is just another word for concentration, but specifically for gases. It means that the first oxygen molecule is going to bind slower. So it's going to bind slower, and it's going to, however, cause a conformational change such that the second and third oxygen molecules will bind more easily. So at these middle partial pressures here in this middle range, this sort of like steep range of my curve is demonstrating that the second and third oxygen are binding quite efficiently. And at high partial pressures of oxygen in that final bit of my curve is where my hemoglobin is actually going to get completely saturated with oxygen. Let's have a look at a classic exemplar question. Red blood cells are crucial for the transport of oxygen to the tissues in mammals. Many molecules of hemoglobin are present within each red blood cells and contribute to their function. Describe the role of hemoglobin in oxygen transport in mammals. 3 marks only describe, no explain. What is my context? Hemoglobin in red blood cells, and the fact that it's important for cell function. What is my command? To write out the role of hemoglobin, not why. And what is by direction? Only focusing on the oxygen transport functions of hemoglobin. So hemoglobin has a high affinity for oxygen when the oxygen partial pressure is high, meaning what? That when hemoglobin is at the lungs, it will bind regions of high partial pressure of oxygen. So where? Let me just show you. Let me just relate it to the curve. So the top right, sorry, I can't jot down here, but the top right-hand bit of the curve with high partial pressures of oxygen, that is where hemoglobin is going to have a high affinity for oxygen, and it forms oxyhemoglobin. So that's one mark. It then transports the bound oxygen to respiring tissues where the oxygen is released. Why? How? Because oxygen is released at the low oxygen partial pressure, so the bottom left part of my curve, at respiring tissues. Respiring tissues have low partial pressures of oxygen because they're using the oxygen, of course, for respiration. And so my hemoglobin affinity is going to have a lower affinity at the respiring tissues with lower partial pressures. So the key here in describing the role of hemoglobin is describing the idea that hemoglobin has different affinities for oxygen depending on the partial pressures of oxygen. High affinity when oxygen is abundant, high partial pressures. That's good because it can bind oxygen. Low affinity at low partial pressures.